time, many Americans find themselves feeling the effects of the longest government shutdown on record. The scene playing out on repeat at airports across the country today. Hundreds of planes grounded, thousands of flights delayed or canceled, leaving travelers frustrated and concerned.
It's absurd. I think it's a complete failure of government, and the government serving itself and not the people. It's driving me nuts.
Terrible. It's just...
The pain has been building for weeks at American airports, but few are prepared for what comes next.
They have to come to a solution. This is not good.
Beginning Friday, the 40 largest airports in the country, in cities like New York, Chicago, LA, and Washington, will reduce their number of daily flights by 10%, beginning gradually and ultimately grounding about 5,000 flights per day.
What do you think this is?
King's protests. Millions of Americans from New York to Georgia to Texas and California and many other states and cities in between taking to the streets to protest the Trump administration's policies. It may be the largest one-day protest in the U.S. in more than 50 years. Here's ABC's Andrew Dimbert.
Tonight, President Trump mocking the millions of Americans who took to the streets in peaceful protest on Saturday in what has been described as one of the largest
I am currently booked on a 1 o'clock flight from Newark, New Jersey to Jacksonville, Florida. Of course, it's 9:30 in the morning and I'm here out of fear that my flight could be canceled.
Yesterday, I mean, the lines were like wrapped all the way around this corner right here.
If I were you, I would not travel over the next 3 days. It's going to get worse.
What you're about to hear is the story Washington never thought would escape the boardrooms, the leaked memos, and the panicked closed-door meetings. Because for decades, the United States believed that global aviation would always revolve around its airports, its economy, its prestige. But this time, the world made a different choice. And it started thousands of miles away, not in New York, not in Los Angeles, but in Africa. Yes, Africa. The continent Washington underestimated for a century is now at the center of a global aviation revolution. Asia's biggest airlines, the same giants that once fought for U.S. landing slots, are abandoning America overnight. Not because of politics alone, but because Africa has become the new gateway of global trade, tourism, and investment. A new economic engine with stronger growth, cheaper fuel, newer airports, fairer policies, and a future that actually moves. Inside U.S. airports, the impact has been nothing short of catastrophic. Terminals that were once overflowing with Asian travelers now stand half empty. Entire wings of international airports have gone dark. Ticket counters are shuttered. Restaurants are closing. Baggage workers, pilots, and ground crews are being laid off. And for the first time in modern history, America's aviation industry isn't expanding, it's collapsing. Meanwhile, Africa's skylines tell a different story. Brand new mega airports in East, West, and Southern Africa are operating at full capacity. Cargo hubs are moving record tonnage. Tourism numbers are exploding, and Asia is pouring billions into aviation partnerships that are creating new jobs, new cities, new opportunities, and new geopolitical alliances Washington never saw coming. Because here's the truth, this isn't a simple shift in flight routes. This is a shift in world power. Every flight redirected from America to Africa is a transfer of influence, money, investors, and global attention. This is how a new world order begins, not with armies, not with weapons, not with speeches, but with airlines quietly turning their aircraft toward the future. And the future right now is Africa. While the United States scrambles to understand what went wrong, African nations are building a new economic highway between themselves and Asia, one that bypasses the U.S. entirely. One that America cannot control, cannot interrupt, and cannot reverse. So the real question isn't why Asian airlines are leaving the U.S., the real question is, what happens to America when the world no longer needs its airports, its market, or its approval? Because that moment has already begun.
News travel chaos in United States. 3.2 million passengers stranded by U.S. shutdown. The U.S. government shutdown has thrown the aviation system into chaos, grounding or delaying flights for more than 3.2 million passengers and counting. Airports are reporting massive lines, short-staffed, and TSA checkpoints and cancelled flights.
Dallas, but we already feel the heat of the spring and summer travel.
More than 160 American Airlines pilots did not spend Thursday morning in the cockpit. Instead, Captain Dennis Tager and the Allied Pilots Association stood outside DFW Airport's Terminal C.
We're out here for an improved schedule, which will lead to improved quality of life for our pilots, but most importantly, will make sure that our passengers get what they pay for, and that's a reliable airline.
Maybe you were one of the many passengers left.
The shift began quietly, almost too quietly for the United States to notice. For years, Asian airlines had treated American airports as crown jewels gateways to enormous passenger traffic, business travelers, tech investors, and students. Flights from China, Singapore, Japan, South Korea, and the wider Southeast Asian region packed. Terminals across San Francisco, Los Angeles, New York, Chicago, and Seattle. The U.S. believed this flow was permanent, unshakable, guaranteed. But global aviation was evolving, and while America was standing still, Africa was transforming at unimaginable speed. It started with a bold initiative led by several African nations that wanted to break away from outdated aviation agreements that favored Western hubs. Countries like Ethiopia, Rwanda, Kenya, South Africa, Morocco, and Egypt accelerated massive expansions of airports, creating brand new terminals capable of handling tens of millions of passengers a year. Runways were extended, cargo capacities were increased, and new long-haul fleets were purchased. African governments saw aviation, not just as transportation but as economic engines, linking their growing cities to the world. Asian airlines took notice even before the United States realized it was happening. The real pivot began when Africa opened its skies with a sweeping continental aviation reform that removed old restrictions on foreign carriers, reduced landing fees, and guaranteed strategic partnerships to airlines willing to invest long-term. Asian executives saw something far more valuable than American markets: growth. Africa's middle class was rising faster than any other region. New business districts were emerging in Lagos, Nairobi, Johannesburg, Cairo, Addis Ababa, and Accra. Young populations were traveling more, studying abroad, attending global conferences, and building cross-border companies. Asia wanted to be part of this future, and Africa welcomed them with open arms. In contrast, America made it difficult. Asian airlines complained about costly regulatory hurdles, outdated air traffic systems, high airport taxes, and the increasingly hostile political climate affecting trade. A new wave of protectionist policies made expansions harder. Security delays grew worse, customer satisfaction plummeted, and tensions with several Asian governments created an atmosphere of uncertainty. Airlines were tired of the political unpredictability. Meanwhile, African nations were offering lower operating costs, modern infrastructure, and routes with fewer diplomatic complications. The tipping point came when three major Asian carriers simultaneously downgraded their U.S. routes. Instead of launching new flights to Los Angeles or Houston, plans that had been years in the making, they redirected their fleets toward African capitals experiencing economic booms. Overnight, flights that once connected millions of passengers through U.S. airports were redirected through Addis Ababa, Johannesburg, Cairo, and Casablanca. The United States did not expect the consequences to hit so brutally. Passenger traffic collapsed. Airport terminals that once buzzed with travelers from Tokyo, Seoul, Beijing, and Singapore suddenly saw empty gates. Duty-free shops went silent. Luxury brand revenues dropped by double digits. Hotels surrounding major airports saw booking cancellations. Taxi and shuttle services reported their worst downturn in 3 decades. U.S. aviation analysts were stunned. They had predicted slow shrinkage, not a sudden abandonment. Cargo routes were even more devastating. America depended heavily on air freight from Asia for electronics, medical equipment, semiconductors, auto parts, textiles, and consumer goods. When Asian airlines rerouted their cargo operations to African logistics hubs, especially those in East and North Africa, U.S. supply chains stumbled. Shipments that used to take 13 hours to arrive now required longer routes through African distribution centers, adding time and cost for American companies. Importers began reporting delayed deliveries and massive losses. The aviation industry warned that the U.S. might be entering a long-term decline, losing its position as a global transit leader. What truly alarmed Washington was the shift in global prestige. Asian airlines publicly stated that Africa was the future of global aviation, a phrase that stung U.S. officials who believed America still dominated the skies. But African cities had become more appealing: young, vibrant, economically ambitious, and globally connected. Asian governments deepened partnerships with African nations, promising not just flights but investments in maintenance hubs, aircraft training academies, tourism development, and regional airports. In comparison, American airports felt outdated. Terminals built decades ago were struggling to keep up with technological demands. Delays became legendary. travelers from Asia complained about long immigration lines, inconsistent policies, and frequent cancellations. Asian airlines could not justify pouring millions into routes that offered diminishing returns. Africa, meanwhile, was offering everything the aviation industry craved. The final blow came when several Asian governments offered long-term aviation treaties favoring African partnerships. These agreements included fuel subsidies, tax exemptions, and joint ventures that cut costs dramatically. American airports, drowning in debt, and bureaucracy could not compete. Airlines made the decision less out of politics and more out of mathematical certainty. Africa was cheaper, smarter, and growing exponentially. As U.S. airports watched their international traffic collapse, African airports celebrated record numbers. New terminals filled with travelers connecting between Africa and Asia. Tourism surged. Trade expanded, and new cultural exchanges blossomed. America tried to reverse the trend, offering emergency incentives, but it was too late. Asian airlines now viewed Africa as the new aviation gateway between the East and the global South. And so the collapse of U.S. airports became not just a logistical crisis, but a symbolic one. A sign that the center of global travel had shifted. A sign that opportunities no longer pointed toward America but toward a continent rising with unstoppable momentum. The shift was irreversible, undeniable, and a warning to the West that the future of aviation now soared across African skies. The shift grew even more dramatic as African nations capitalized on their newfound aviation power. With Asian airlines pouring into the continent, Africa quickly realized it held leverage over a transportation system that had long been dominated by Western interests. The momentum was unmistakable. African governments began coordinating more closely, aligning policies on aviation, trade, tourism, and infrastructure to create a unified corridor that made flying through Africa not only cheaper but far more efficient than landing in the United States. The United States tried to respond by offering incentives to Asian airlines, but those efforts were too weak and too late. African airports were now offering multi-decade partnership guarantees, profit-sharing agreements, and ultra-modern facilities that rivaled and even exceeded many U.S. airports. What made Africa even more appealing was that its governments were flexible, forward-looking, and willing to adapt quickly to global trends, something Washington struggled to do. Asian carriers began shifting their fleet deployment strategies. Wide-body aircraft that once served major U.S. cities were now stationed in African hubs that were rapidly expanding to meet demand. New runways opened every year across East, West, and North Africa. Maintenance and repair centers were built using advanced technology, supplied by Asian manufacturers. Airlines found they could operate at lower cost, reduce layover times, and increase passenger satisfaction, all while avoiding the bureaucratic challenges endemic to the United States. Africa did not simply become a destination, it became the bridge between continents. The connection between Asia, Africa, and South America strengthened. African airports became transit centers for flights that once required stops in Los Angeles or Miami. Now, a traveler from Asia heading to Brazil or Argentina could fly through Africa in less time, with less hassle, and often at a lower price. Freight companies took interest too. This rearrangement of global routes had consequences far beyond aviation. American tech companies, pharmaceutical firms, and auto part suppliers had relied heavily on fast Asian air freight to keep production lines running. With fewer direct routes to the U.S., the cost of shipping Asian goods soared. Delays became routine. Some factories in the Midwest and West Coast were forced to halt production temporarily, because essential parts from Japan, South Korea, or China were stuck in Africa awaiting rerouting. The supply chain strain worsened as Asian airlines prioritized African hubs that offered them more predictable revenue streams. Washington called emergency meetings. Officials blamed foreign governments, blamed trade tensions, blamed airline executives, but rarely admitted the truth. America had failed to invest in its aviation system. While African nations had been building futuristic terminals with robotic baggage handlers, automated customs systems, and AI-driven traffic control towers, the U.S. was still operating terminals built in the 1970s and 1980 seconds. Delays, outages, and breakdowns were commonplace. Asian airlines no longer wanted to take on that risk. Meanwhile, Africa's rise was accelerated by its strategic location. The continent was geographically positioned to serve as the central node in a new global travel network connecting Asia, Europe, and South America. Asian airlines recognized that flying through Africa reduced distances and fuel usage on many long-haul routes, savings that could not be ignored. African nations, realizing their advantage, invested aggressively in renewable aviation fuel, new navigation systems, and next-generation aircraft infrastructure. The more Asia invested, the more Africa grew. New tourism campaigns launched across African countries, attracting millions of visitors from across Asia who now found direct or one-stop flights far easier. Hotels, resorts, entertainment districts, and transportation services experienced a boom. African governments reinvested profits into even more airport expansions, creating a cycle of growth that made withdrawals from the U.S. aviation market permanent. Internally, American airports faced a financial crisis. The drop in international flights reduced revenue from landing fees, passenger taxes, airline leases, and retail rent. Airport authorities began announcing layoffs, downsizing projects, and even temporary closures of certain terminals. Reports surfaced of airports operating at less than 40% of their international capacity. Air carriers that depended on Asian partnerships were forced to reduce staff, cancel routes, and renegotiate debts. But the worst blow to the U.S. wasn't financial, it was psychological. For decades, American airports were symbols of global leadership. They represented innovation, prosperity, mobility, and confidence. The idea that carriers from Asia regions with some of the most advanced airlines on Earth would choose Africa over America was shocking. It was an admission that Africa was no longer the overlooked continent of outdated stereotypes. It had become a global aviation superpower. Some U.S. politicians accused African nations of being manipulated by Asia, but that argument collapsed quickly. Africa was setting its own terms, shaping its own future, and building partnerships that benefited its own people. The era of one-sided dependency was over. African leaders proudly declared that their continent would no longer sit at the margins of global transportation. Instead, Africa would be the crossroads of the world, and this confidence resonated across the globe. African airports began winning international awards for efficiency, design, customer satisfaction, and environmental sustainability. Foreign students studying aviation engineering increasingly chose African universities. Airlines launched recruitment drives across African countries, hiring thousands of crew members, technicians, and pilots. Job creation soared. Economic zones around airports transformed into tech parks, trade centers, and financial hubs. Meanwhile, major U.S. airports that once boasted about global rankings found themselves falling behind. International travelers increasingly chose connecting flights through African hubs because they were cheaper, cleaner, faster, and more reliable. Data revealed that for many routes, choosing Africa shaved hours off flight times. The U.S. response grew more desperate. Some officials proposed subsidizing Asian airlines to return. Others pushed for emergency funding for airport renovations. But by the time these measures were discussed, Africa had already cemented its partnerships and carved its place in the global aviation map. Asia and Africa had built something new, something resilient, modern, and forward-looking. America had simply been left behind, and as more Asian carriers expanded their African networks, the message became undeniable. The future of global aviation was no longer centered on America. It was rising from African runways, powered by African ambition, and guided by a new generation of leaders who were determined to shape the world on their own terms. The shockwaves from the aviation realignment spread far beyond the airports themselves as the strategic implications became impossible to ignore. Asia's shift toward Africa was no simple commercial decision. Global analysts began to uncover a deeper pattern, revealing that a new world architecture was being quietly constructed. What began as airline route adjustments had evolved into a sweeping redistribution of economic influence, one that fundamentally challenged the United States' long-standing dominance in global transportation networks. Africa, once viewed as a peripheral node in global aviation, had suddenly become the central axis around which long-haul routes now revolved. This transformation forced governments around the world to reassess their geopolitical strategies. Asia's aviation giants were not just moving airplanes, they were redirecting economic power, investment flows, logistical pipelines, and the very psychology of global mobility. In African capitals, leaders understood that the world was entering a new era and that aviation dominance would become as critical as digital infrastructure, energy independence, or mineral control. Airports were being reimagined as political tools, not just transit hubs. They were the gateways to new alliances, economic frameworks, and global influence. African nations seized the opportunity with remarkable precision, using their newfound leverage to negotiate trade deals, secure technology transfers, and demand fairer partnership terms that had been denied to them for decades. The United States, meanwhile, struggled to comprehend that it was losing influence not through war, sanctions, or diplomacy, but through the silent redirection of aircraft. There was no dramatic announcement, no treaty signing, no public confrontation. The decline occurred quietly in flight logs, passenger choices, and cargo statistics. Each plane diverted to Africa was another indicator that the world was changing. As African airports gained prominence, they became gathering points for global financial institutions, tech innovators, and tourism boards seeking access to an expanding consumer base. Real estate markets near these new aviation corridors exploded. African cities that were once overlooked were now emerging as major commercial hubs, connected directly to Asia's biggest economic engines. Investors from the Middle East, Southeast Asia, and even parts of Europe poured into these regions, seeking to capitalize on the opportunities created by the aviation boom. The transformation also had a profound cultural impact. For the first time, millions of travelers from Asia, South America, and even parts of Europe were experiencing Africa not through outdated stereotypes but as a modern, confident, technologically advancing continent. The narrative of the continent shifted instead of being seen. As dependent on foreign aid, Africa was now recognized as a global leader in aviation and logistics. This shift challenged long-standing Western narratives, especially those held in the United States. For decades, American policymakers had assumed that African development would always depend on Western support. Now, African nations were proving that they could partner with Asian powers to build futuristic aviation ecosystems that outperformed American systems. This narrative reversal was deeply unsettling in Washington, where political leaders struggled to reassure the public that the U.S. still maintained global influence. Airlines in Asia capitalized on Africa's confidence and growth, expanding their partnerships into education, aerospace technology, and manufacturing. African universities began offering aviation engineering programs in cooperation with Asian institutions. Maintenance and repair centers built across Africa created tens of thousands of jobs, serving aircraft fleets that once would have been serviced in the United States or Europe. African pilots, technicians, and air traffic controllers were trained using some of the most advanced systems in the world. Meanwhile, U.S. aviation workers faced layoffs as international traffic declined. Pilots whose entire career paths depended on trans-Pacific or transatlantic routes now found themselves with shrinking opportunities. Ground crews at major American airports reported significant reductions in flights from Asia. Local economies around these airports suffered as restaurants, hotels, fuel suppliers, taxi services, and logistics companies saw their revenues collapse. But the crisis in the U.S. extended beyond economics. It affected national identity. Aviation had always been a symbol of American ingenuity, competition, and global leadership. The fact that African and Asian partnerships were now defining the future of global travel created an uncomfortable narrative. It highlighted America's refusal to modernize, its aging infrastructure, its overburdened regulatory environment, and its failure to adapt to global changes. Africa's rise revealed America's stagnation. African leaders did not hesitate to capitalize on this momentum. They expanded bilateral agreements with Asian nations, securing long-term commitments for airport upgrades, technology sharing, and joint ownership of aviation infrastructure. African air carriers, once small and regionally focused, began expanding internationally, powered by new investments. Their fleets grew rapidly, introducing brand new long-haul aircraft and entering markets once dominated by U.S. carriers. Energy companies followed the trend. Africa's new aviation strength sparked growth in local fuel production, refining, and storage. Renewable aviation fuel research accelerated, giving African nations a head start in the future of eco-friendly aviation. Cargo companies, observing Africa's efficiency and its central geographic position, began shifting their logistics hubs from the United States to African ports and airports. This sparked yet another crisis in America. Freight forwarding companies that once relied on U.S. ports and airports were forced to adjust to longer delivery times and higher fuel costs. Warehouses in U.S. logistics corridors saw steep declines in activity. Retailers struggled to restock shelves on time, blaming supply disruptions linked to the loss of major Asian routes. Consumers felt the impact through delayed deliveries and high prices. Meanwhile, African nations continued strengthening their position by coordinating their aviation regulations, standardizing safety protocols, and opening shared airspace to reduce flight time across the continent. This integration created a seamless corridor for international flights. What Asia and Africa were building together was more than a transportation network. It was a geopolitical alliance powered by mobility, efficiency, and economic logic. The United States attempted to regain influence by proposing new aviation partnerships with Asian carriers, but these proposals lacked the clarity, vision, and long-term benefits that Africa offered. Asian nations recognized Africa's potential for rapid growth and positioned themselves accordingly. They saw the continent not as a temporary market but as the future heart of global aviation. Washington's frustration grew as African airports continued receiving global awards and recognition. International conferences that once took place in European or American cities were increasingly hosted in Africa. Business travelers and global leaders began favoring African hubs for major summits and trade negotiations. This signaled a symbolic shift. Africa was no longer a destination, it was becoming the center stage. The shift of Asian airlines away from the United States toward Africa was more than a transportation story. It was a powerful reminder that influence follows opportunity, investment follows vision, and the world favors regions that embrace innovation over complacency. Africa and Asia had built a new aviation empire, and the United States, once the uncontested leader, now watched from the sidelines as global power took flight elsewhere.